In this lesson, we're going to talk about hard surface in ZBrush. Now, hard surface in ZBrush is actually referring to a variety of different brushes and tools. Those include things like the planer brush and the trim brushes, the polish brushes, as well as mesh-based tools like group loops and panel loops. In this video, we're going to take a look at all of these. I'm going to start with a sphere. Just go to the tool menu here under the light box, and let's open a polysphere. I'll draw this on the canvas and go into edit mode. F for frame, and then turn on X symmetry. Now, we'll start with probably the most obvious of hard surface brushes. That's the planer brush. So I'll select B for brush, P for planer, and here you see we have the planer brush. The hotkey is L. If I turn my draw size up and then start to click on the model, you see it doesn't really seem to do anything. It's just creating these little chiseled flat portions of the model here. Now, what the planer brush is doing is it's sampling the first surface normal that you touch, and then it reduces, it slices down a certain degree and flattens everything to that point. So to use the planer brush, we have to turn on the depth control here under the brush menu. Now, this will actually work for any brush, but it works specifically for the planer brushes because the planer brushes, like I said, sample the first surface normal and then flatten everything to that point. So if I turn embed down to 11, the black line represents the surface of the model, and the point is the depth at which my brush is going to sink. So if I do this now, you see it flattens everything to that point. If I turn my draw size down and then click here, it will flatten, and then I can expand that out. Let's add a subdivision level so we have a bit of a nicer surface here and zoom in a bit. I'll turn my draw size up and I'll do it again. So you see we can just keep planing the surface out like this. Now, if I were to take the clay tubes brush, and let's say we build up a section of mesh here, I can then take the planer brush and flatten planes out from this area that we built up in a very organic fashion. You see, we can essentially start chiseling this away like so. So a lot of times your hard surface sculpting in ZBrush is essentially building up something in a sort of an organic fashion and then further refining it using things like the planer brushes, the trim, and the polish brushes. So there you go. So we'll get this plane right there at the top, and we can just chisel that right down. Now, there's another setting here on the depth control called depth mask, and if I turn that on, I get these two extra dots here. This allows me to control the upper and lower depth, the outer and inner depth, as you see there. We also have a brush depth curve here, which we can control. Now, if I use this brush with the depth controls on, let's turn this up, bring this down, and you see what we get. It starts to leave kind of an island there in the center. Now, to see this most effectively, I'm going to open up a brush that's saved under the Lightbox brush menu. If we go to the planer brushes here, we have planer cut thin and planer cut X thin. I'll use planer cut X thin, that's extra thin. You see the depth mask is set up like this. It's very, very narrow. So if I click on a section of model, let's find a good area that we can utilize here. Turn our draw size down and see if we can't get a nice result from this. I'm going to turn my outer depth up just a little bit, and there we go. You can see this allows us to plane along an edge here. If I go back and select planer cut thin, extra thin is just a little bit too thin for us to see what we're trying to get. Take the same brush, and now you see what's happening is it's countersinking 6, it's embedding 6 units, and then it's limiting the inner and outer depth. So it's creating these kinds of floating islands. Now, this is really cool for making these sorts of hard surface kind of machined greebles. Greebles are a term from physical model making from back in the 70s, where people would, if you were building a model of the Death Star, for example, they would go get model kits from the shop and then take little random pieces and glue it onto a larger model to give it the illusion of scale and complexity. So these little sort of floating islands make really nice greebles. So we could turn that into, for example, an air vent or an exhaust hose or something like that. Now that is depth masking. If I turn depth mask off, my planer brush returns to its normal behavior. Now let's say I've got something like this where I have an island which I have on my surface and I want to get rid of it. If I take my embed and set this to 0, if I click this face here, it's going to sample that surface normal. Let's actually turn our draw size down. It's going to sample this surface normal, and then there we go. We can flatten everything to that point. I'm going to go B for brush, P for planer, go back to my planer brush. There we go. Make sure that I turn off depth mask and set my embed to 0. There we go. Click on this face here, and then it will erase that island. If I go back to my brush menu here and go to the planer cut thin, you see that this actually has been modified using the depth masking. So that's what creates those islands. So it's the same brush, it's just been modified with depth masking. Go back to planer, and I can erase any sort of hanging or floating islands with this brush. So I'm going to go back to the original sphere. I'm just going to drag my undo history back, add a couple subdivision levels again, and then I'm going to take my clay tubes brush and let's just build up a few shapes on here. Make sure that our X symmetry is turned on. Now, when you're building up for hard surface, that's one situation where I think the clay build-up brush is actually quite good to use. I've said previously that I prefer using the clay tubes brush, but if I go to B for brush, C for clay, there's clay build-up. Now this is just the clay tubes brush with build-up mode turned on, so each time I run my brush stroke over itself, it builds up in a really aggressive kind of manner. So it builds these things up quite strong. So I can use this to build up these shapes here and here. And now I'll go to B for brush, P for polish, and I'll select the polish brush. Now the polish brush does pretty much what you would expect. It polishes the surface. Now if you look, it's sort of pulling things out to the point that I'm clicking and polishing things like this. If I turn my Z intensity up, I'll get a much stronger effect on the brush. So this is really good for taking care of any sort of like surface nuances or nicks or scratches in the surface. I can polish these things out. So it's really nice to just sculpturally build up the type of machined surface that we want, and then we can further refine it with some of the other brushes. So if I polish these shapes here, this shape here, and then we'll polish this shape up here, we can start to work our way out to the type of form that we want. So you see, as I go over that edge, it creates a sort of sharp edge there. If I come over to this side, turn my draw size down, I can polish up to that edge. I'll do the same thing here. Now these brushes tend to work best with enough subdivision levels, so I've divided this up to about 6 million polygons just because it's going to help me get a nicer, sharper edge there. So now I'll go to B for brush and S. S allows us to grab a brush called S polish. That's the soft polish brush. Now that's just the polish brush with a softer effect. So if I use this brush, let me turn my Z intensity up so you can see it a little bit more clearly. It's the same kind of polish brush, but and you'll have to sort of experiment with this to get a feel for it, but it has a softer effect. And a lot of people really prefer the S polish brush to the polish brush. So that's just something to consider. So let's go ahead and polish this down. And let's polish this transition area right here. You see that we can start to create kind of planes here. So I like this sort of bit of a compound plane that's happening right here where these pieces join together. I'll go to B for brush, T for trim, and there's one of my favorite brushes for hard surface, the Trim Dynamic brush. The Trim Dynamic brush I like because you really can sketch hard surface with it, and that's what makes hard surface in ZBrush so special. It's not like hard surface in Maya where you go in with a plan and you're laying out points for an existing design. You can design hard surface shapes here in ZBrush using these brushes. It allows you to create hard surface forms sculpturally in a sketching kind of workflow. And that's quite unusual and special, and that's what makes hard surface in ZBrush so cool. So let's go ahead and create a little scallop section here. And let's scallop a little section right here. So we'll zoom out from that. Now, I'm going to turn my draw size down, and I'm just going to try and get this little divot here corrected. I'm going to go to my clay tubes brush, and I'm going to fill in that hollow. Remember your clay brushes, any brush that's based on the clay brush, like clay tubes, clay buildup, they always build into the recessed areas first. So that's really good to know if you're trying to fix a problem area like this. So I'll use my Trim Dynamic brush just to polish this back, and I'll use the soft polish to polish this area here. We come over here, we can polish this plane here and get a nice line there. Now we can further clean this up in just a moment using the pinch brushes. The pinch brush has been in ZBrush forever, but there's some nuances to the ways that you can use it that really, really help when you're doing hard surface pieces like this. So let's move over here and do a little bit of work on this area. I'm just going to use soft polish to clean this up. Now I can also use masking like I would for any other brush. I can mask this area out, invert the mask, and then Control-Alt-click on the mask to sharpen it. And I'm just going to clean up the edge there, get that right up to that point. And then I'll use soft polish here to polish out any imperfections that I don't want in this area. I'm going to undo those last two strokes because I want to actually protect this plane here. So I'm going to go ahead and mask right along there. And then Control-Alt, so I can erase a little bit of this masking here, and then Control-Alt-click to sharpen that mask. And then we'll take our polish brush, or soft polish, and just polish this bit right here. Control-click to invert the mask, and then we'll polish this here. And don't be afraid to use a little bit of the smooth brush on this as well. You can clean things up a little bit by using smooth. I'll clear my mask, put a little bit of smoothing along there to get rid of that sort of wiggle in the line. And then I'll use the normal polish brush, B for brush, P for polish, and just get the more aggressive polish brush. Turn my draw size up and just polish through here. And then B for brush, T for trim, D for Trim Dynamic. And then I can just sketch in where I want this plane change to be. I actually use the Trim Dynamic brush quite a bit for organic sculpture as well. You've probably heard me talk about it already, where I like to think about plane changes even when I'm working on an organic form. I think that it's really important to sort of keep in mind the planar analysis of a figure. So I will often use Trim Dynamic when I'm working on something that's an organic shape, just so I can maintain that sort of structural form, which will eventually be smoothed. But as long as you, as you're working, have a clear idea of what your structures are, where your planes are, you'll have a much more successful form. Here I'm just using Trim Dynamic across this noisy surface, just trimming this down. It's just dynamically sampling the surface as you go. There's also a Trim Adaptive brush, which has a slightly different behavior. I don't like it as much, but that's just me. One of the really important things to remember with the ZBrush brushes are that it's up to you which ones you like to use. And I introduce in my training materials the brushes that I like to use and the ones that I've found success with, and show you how I use them. But definitely explore on your own and see what combinations work well for you too, because it's all down to figuring out your own workflow. I'm just trying to save you some time by showing you what works for me. So we have some little sort of nooks and valleys here. So if I go to B for brush, S for soft polish, grab the soft polish brush, turn my draw size down, we can polish out these problem areas. So if you've ever polished a stone or polished some clay, you'll know this feeling. You know exactly what it's doing here. It's just helping you soften down and buff out any kind of problem areas. So let's do the same thing here. Let's polish this section out here. Now again, we're going to be able to tighten up these lines, so don't worry if you've got a little bit of kind of a wiggle in some of these lines. That's not too much of a problem. I'll smooth this back, take my clay tubes brush and turn off my alpha, turn my draw size or my focal shift down, and there we can just fill in that recess. And we'll go to our trim dynamic and just trim this area off here. So we zoom out, you can see what we're getting. We're starting to plane out and get some nice, interesting looking shapes here. So let's tighten these up. I'm going to go to B for brush, P for pinch, and I will select the pinch brush. The pinch brush is right here. The hotkey is I. Now in its default behavior, the pinch brush does this. It pinches edges together, and we really can't see what it's doing very easily. So I'll turn up the Z intensity, and there you can see it's pinching. It's essentially pulling faces together like that. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to use the pinch brush in conjunction with the lazy mouse. So I'm going to turn my Z intensity down a bit on the pinch brush, and I'll go to the stroke menu and tear this menu off. Now here we have the lazy mouse options. If I turn the lazy mouse on, that's going to give me this red line as I make my stroke, and that's just a delay. It helps me smooth out my stroke. So what that does is it allows us to take something like this curve here, and then I can stroke along that curve, and that little delay on the brush helps me correct for any sort of wiggle in my hand as I stroke along that surface. If I turn lazy radius up, that will extend the delay by extending that red line. So if I drag that along there, it's pinched those edges together. Now, I don't recommend trying to get the perfect pinch by changing your Z intensity like this. What I like to do is set my Z intensity pretty low, and then I will run a pinch stroke along the surface like this. Then, under the stroke menu, if you go to modifiers, there's a button here called Replay Last. I have set a custom hotkey for that. That is Alt-1. So if I don't move the model again after I make that stroke and I press Alt-1, it will replay that stroke. So if you watch the surface here, it's replaying that stroke. So let me turn up my Z intensity, and I'll do that stroke again somewhere else. We'll do it right here, for example. I'm going to run a pinch stroke along here. And now I'll press Alt-1, and it replays that stroke, sharpening those faces. If I hold down the Alt key while I pinch, it will pinch in instead of pinching up into a point. So let's do this. I'm going to go into frame mode so you can see this very clearly. I'm going to hold down the Alt key, and I'm going to pinch along this edge right here. You see that it just sort of dragged those edges together. Now I have not moved my model. I have not made another stroke on the surface. So I'm going to either click Replay Last or press my hotkey, which is Option or Alt-1, and it will replay that stroke. So let's do that here. Replay Last. There you can see it's replaying that stroke. So let's do that again. Let me drag the stroke along here. And then Alt-1. If I go into frame mode, you can see what that's doing. So if I turn my brush size down here, I want to do another one here. I want this to pinch in. So I'm going to hold down the Alt key and just drag this down like that. Now replay that stroke, and you see it repeats. Now don't worry about the stretching edges, because I'll show you in a moment how we can fix that. Draw another one here, and then replay stroke. Now take the smooth brush, and we can just smooth across those areas, and it should fix any kind of stretched geometry there, but the pinch is strong enough to maintain. So we've got a little bit of a problem here, so I'm just going to go ahead and smooth this back. I'll turn up the Z intensity on my smooth brush and smooth this stuff back here. Now I'm going to go to my lazy mouse, and I'm going to turn on backtrack. Backtrack forces your mouse or your brush stroke to follow a specific path. I'm going to turn on snap to track. I'm going to turn on line, and I'm going to turn track curvature all the way up. What this does is it forces my stroke to follow a line like this, but it doesn't occur when I first draw the line. It's called backtrack because when I backtrack along that line, you see what it does. It forces that straight edge. So let's do another one here. We'll draw a straight line here and then backtrack it. Then smooth. We should be able to fix up any sort of problems there. Let's do another one here. Drag a straight line here, hold down the Alt key, and I can pinch that in. And again, don't worry about those stretched faces because you just run smooth along it and it will take care of any of those problems. And then I'll just go to the soft polish brush. I'll do B for brush, S for soft polish, grab soft polish, and then we can do a little bit of polishing in any sort of problem areas here. Now this little area here has gotten a little bit out of control. So what I'll do is I'll take my clay tubes brush and I'm just going to erase it. I'm just going to build up on it. Step down a couple subdivision levels, maybe smooth some of this stuff out, just to even all these problem edges out. There we go. Step back up my subdivision levels, and you see that that helps correct for any sort of kicks along that edge there. And then I can just use, for example, my trim dynamic brush to clean up any problems like this. So I'll just run my trim dynamic brush here. Maybe you want to build up a little bit of the faces there using the clay tubes brush, again with no alpha. And go back to our pinch brush. Pinch a line here. And I'll turn backtrack off, so I'm just getting my curve again, or getting my line again. Pinch there. And we can pinch here. And then run the smooth brush to correct any problem areas. Now I'll take the move brush. And don't forget, even though it's hard surface, you can still treat this sculpturally. It is a sculptural hard surface solution, so don't feel like everything has to be accomplished using planes and edges. You can be sculptural and then refine things down again. So for example, here, I am going to mask out this area, which has been giving me some issues. And I'm going to mask out this area. Control-click on the background to invert the mask. And then I'll go to the Tool, Geometry menu, go to Clay Polish here. And we have the option to turn up Sharpen and repeat Sharp, and then click Clay Polish. And what that will do is it will polish the unmasked area and help sort of sharpen up and give us some facets there. So it'll give it more of a sort of hammered metallic look, and it can help clean some of these things up. It's also really handy if you are doing hammered armor. It's quite useful. Maybe I want to go back to my planer brush, make sure that my embed is set. We'll set this down just very, very slightly. We'll actually set that to 2 units. 2, there we go. And then I can planer this. Oops. I'm on my standard brush and not my planer brush. B for brush, P for planer. Make sure that I grab the planer brush. There we go. And set that embed to 2. Might not be enough, but we'll see. And I can start to plane this down. I want this to actually go a little bit lower, so let's turn that. 11 might be a bit too much. Nope, that's good. There we go. So I'm going to undo back to my original shape. And I'm going to turn down my planer. And I'm just going to plane that right down like that. There we go. Now, smooth some of this back. Take my trim dynamic brush and work out any of these areas, remembering to adjust your brush size as you go. Smoothing. Don't forget, you can smooth. A lot of times when I was first starting out with the planer brushes, I was trying not to smooth or use any sort of sculptural solution, and it was a real pain. So I'm going to go back to B for brush, P for pinch, I. Go back to my stroke menu, Turn on backtrack again, and let's just do a little pinch right here. Turn that draw size up, and then replay that stroke. Do a little pinch here, replay that stroke. And let's turn backtrack off and hold down the Alt key. I'm going to start my pinch from here, run it to here, and then replay that stroke. And then smooth that transition. We'll do the same thing here. I'm going to start from here, holding down the Alt key so I pinch in, and then replay that stroke. There we go. Run the smooth brush along it. And then I'll go back to B for brush, S for soft polish, grab my soft polish brush, and then we can do more polishing along these surfaces here. There we go. Oops, I overshot that a little bit, turn my brush size down. There we go. So I'm going to polish this area here. And I'll go back to my brushes, and we'll go to the planar cut thin. And then I will just take this brush, and then we can countersink a shape right here. You see the way that works is it sort of flattens everything out to this island. And actually, if you just keep running that brush over the surface, you can get some really interesting shapes here. If I undo that, turn my draw size up, it's going to impact, obviously, the size of that island. If I turn my draw size down, bring them here, see what we get. So I kind of like this effect that we're getting here. Now, right now, I'm only at 6 million polygons. We're getting some sort of stretchy bits and pieces here. So I can run a little bit of smooth on that, perhaps increase my resolution, and that's going to give me a better edge there. So let's take the same thing over here on the side. If I do that planar cut thin, I can start to cut kind of detailing here. I can cut some detailing here. Do the same thing here. You can create some sort of islands right there, some bits of detail. So let's put this into practice. Let's go all the way back to our sphere. We're going to drag our undo history all the way back to the very, very beginning, and we're going to create a helmet using these tools. We're also going to introduce a couple of other things. We're going to introduce polygroups, polyloops, and group loops. Those are ways of cutting new edges in your geometry that facilitate creating things like paneling and extrusions that are a bit harder to get, as you saw on the sphere just with the brushes, because we start to get those jaggies along the edges. It's not a clean solution. So we want to take a look at how we can use edge looping to extrude out panels and different hard surface details. So here we are back at the beginning of our undo history. And I'm going to start, because we're going to make a helmet, I'm going to start by just creating the general shape of the helmet. So we'll snap to the front view here. We can use our little quick guide head there. And let's just start to create the oval shape of the helmet. We'll pull it back, go to the top view, pull it out a little bit from up here. We're just creating just a very general shape of the helmet, that's all. There we go. And from the bottom view, let's make sure that we've got sort of the area where the head would go up into that helmet, maybe a little bit of an area for the shape of the face there. And I'll just smooth it a little bit with a smooth brush. Just getting a general form, that's all. That's all we're concerned with. There we go. Now I'll step back up my subdivision levels, take my trim dynamic brush, and just do a little bit of sketching of the most general planes here. I just want to polish up some of these sides a little bit. Get a plane change here, maybe back here. Nothing too specific at all. That's not important at this stage. This is a rough in. You know that, for many, many years, cars were designed in clay. They used a clay called Chavant. And their car sculpting was, a amazing discipline. And a lot of industrial design was done in clay. And those things always start with big planar shapes, just like this. So we start with big planar shapes, just getting a clear idea of what our helmet's going to be. And that's just going to help us out in the long run as we try and clean things up. There we go. And there we go. Now, I want to group loop this. Group looping, or panel looping, there are two different types of poly looping. We find that under the tool menu. Under geometry, we have edge loop. Now, we have group loops, which carves an edge loop around a polygroup. And we have panel loops, which carves an edge loop around a polygroup, but also extrudes it. All right, so what we're going to do here is I'm just going to do a couple more little planes here with my trim dynamic brush. B for brush, T for trim, D for trim dynamic. I just want to fix this area here because it's bothering me and I want that to be a bit cleaner. So I'm going to take my move brush, pull that forward, pull that down, and go back to the trim dynamic brush and just do a little bit of planing right there. There we go. So I'm going to establish some polygroups here. We'll do that just with masking. So I'm going to go into frame mode. You can see it's not a very dense mesh right now. We only have 24,000 faces. I could add a subdivision level to give us a nicer mask. So I want to create sort of maybe a panel loop here. And I definitely want a panel loop for a visor. So we're going to go ahead and loop out where our visor is going to be, like this, and we're just going to fill that in with mask. I want to make another little shape here. Now, a cool way of doing this actually is turn your perspective off, hold down the control key for masking, and you can actually change to the mask lasso, and you can then lasso out a shape like that, and then that projects all the way through the surface. So that can be quite a cool way of going about doing this as well. Perhaps we'll do another group right here for like the bottom edge of the helmet. And let's do something along the top. Let's go ahead and do another mask here, and I'm just using that lasso like this, and then that creates a shape like this. Now, I could clean that up, so I'll just hold down the control key and go back to mask pen, and I just want to sharpen that up. Now I will go to Tool, Polygroups, and here we have all of our polygroup options, and I can group masked. So I will go ahead and group masked, go to frame mode, and you can see that that has put a polygroup there for all of my masked polygons. But those groups, they have a jagged edge on them. So like you saw earlier where I was using just the brushes to create hard surface, it's going to give me a jagged edge. If I took these, Control-Shift-clicked on them to mask them, Control-click on the background to mask everything, and then reveal all by Control-Shift-clicking on the background, then Control-click on the background to invert my masking. If I went to, for example, the deformation menu and I took inflate and turn that up, you see it will inflate those panels out, but that's the problem. You're going to get jaggies there. We don't want that. So what we want to do is we want to clean up these edges by using some kind of edge looping. Now, under Tool Geometry, we could carve edge loops just by creating an edge loop. We could do group loops, which would carve an edge loop around just these groups, or we could do panel loops. Now, I'll show you both. Group loops does this. If I click that, I need to make sure that I delete my lower subdivision levels. That's one thing. It will only work on a mesh that does not have subdivision levels. So let me undo that. Go down here, delete lower, step up a subdivision level, delete lower. There we go. You notice what happened there. That doesn't happen a lot, but when I deleted lower, it sort of gave me the wrong polygrouping. So in case you're wondering, I just undid it and then redid it. So here we go. We've got our polygrouping. So I'm just going to click group loops. And then you see what it does is it carves a new edge loop, several edge loops around those panel looped or those polygrouped areas. So now if I were to isolate these polygroups and then let's actually just mask the red portion. If I did this, and then I did that same deformation inflate, we get a much sharper, cleaner extrusion, like you see there. So that's group looping. Now you might want to use that because you can then isolate the individual poly loops that are going around just by Control-Shift clicking on them. If I undo back before that group looping, we can look at our other option. Our other option is panel looping. Now panel looping does this. We can set the number of loops. We can set our group polish. We can, that's our group loops. We can set our number of loops here for panel loops. We can decide whether or not we want them double-sided or not. And we can set the thickness. So if I just leave it as is and click a panel loops, you see what we get. We get this, which etches a line around the paneling. Now, if I want that line to be bigger, I'll undo it and I'll change my thickness. I'll set it to 0.05. It was 0.01. We'll set 0.05 and then panel loop. Now you see we get a bigger sort of gutter there. Now the edges kind of meander. They're not very attractive. So let's undo that. You'll also notice it sort of offsets things a little bit. That's the elevation slider here. So we've got our bevel settings here. We have our polish settings here. These are all for panel loops right here. These are for group loops, so don't confuse them. They're very close together. Panel looping are all of these options here. We can use the bevel profile, the curve to set the profile of our bevel. We can set the width of our bevel here. And the elevation is the distance it extends off the original surface. So if I turn this down to 50, it was at 100. We'll set it to 50, hit enter, and then panel loop. You see we don't get quite as much of an elevation. If I bring this down even lower, let's set that to 9, panel loop, you see we get that. So it stays closer to our original surface, which can often be quite desirable. But we still have this sort of meandering quality to the lines, which we don't want. So how do we correct that? Luckily, it's very easy. Go to the deformation menu here under the tool menu, and we have polish by features. Now, by default, this little circle is filled. If I turn this up, it's a very subtle kind of polish. If I turn this button on, like this, and then run polish by features, it has this wonderful impact on the surface, cleaning up all those little human inaccuracies in the brush stroke. So there we go. So now if we go into frame mode, you see we've got our individual panel looping. Now this is something I want to point out. You'll notice the panel loops are separated, all right? So we can actually see down there inside a bit. For that reason, I like to duplicate my model before I do any panel looping. What that does is it gives me a copy sitting on the inside as kind of a shell. And sometimes I can actually use that as an exposed area of inner lining. Maybe I'll put a texture on it or do some sculpting on this. So if I duplicate this now and then do the panel looping with the same settings that we had, turn off frame mode. Now if I go back to my original here, and I'm going to set a really obvious material there. Let's set a droplet material on there, and I'll turn on material, go to color, fill object, and then let's go to our panel looped version, which is here, and we'll change to our basic material too. And then if I were to, let's say, zoom in here, you can see that other object down underneath there. So that's going to be useful if, let's say, we go back to our polish by features. Make sure that we get that cleaned up nicely. Let's say I isolate this panel here. I'm going to select just hide this one here and invert my visibility. So there we go. So here you can see I can reveal portions of the underlying mesh. If I Control-Shift click on the background, I can reveal all again. So it's nice to have that extra piece down there. If I were to hide this panel here, you can see what we get. Now those panels, they're all the same polygroup. So if I Control-Shift click on them, it's going to show and hide everybody. So what I will do is I will isolate just that polygroup. just that one, not the other edges, just this one here. And I will go back to my polygroup menu and I will click auto group, and that gives each one of those its own polygroup. So now I can easily just hide one like that. Or maybe I want the visor to be this sort of mirror sheen. I can do something like that. So that's really handy. So you can see already that the hard surface tools are really a combination of a variety of different things that we work together in conjunction. So it doesn't all have to be brushed based. So let's say I want to take this area down here. I'm going to isolate that particular polygroup, mask everyone else, and then reveal all. I'll go to my transpose line. And with the transpose line, I will go to the unmasked mesh center. Let's turn off X symmetry so it goes to the proper center of this unmasked area. And if I scale this out, I can get this nice lip there along the bottom edge of that helmet. Maybe I want to bring this down a little bit. You can see that starting to give me this sort of stretching there. If I go into frame mode, you see what's happening. So what I will do is I will undo that. And I am going to hide this group, and I'm going to hide its thickness there. Invert visibility. Look what happens. The thickness all has the same polygroup, just like those panels did. So I'll need to hide this panel, and now I've got all of my thickness edge loops visible. Here you can see what they look like. I'll turn on solo so you can see it very clearly. Now there's different polygroups here. So you have a choice. You can polygroup these all as individual objects, or you can still sort of maintain those polygroups that we have. So if I were to isolate, let's undo that. I can isolate one of these loops, maintain the others. I personally find that to be a little bit much to deal with. So I just want each bit of thickness to be polygrouped as its own thing. So I'll click auto group. Now each one of those has its own thickness. So now what I can do is I can come down here and I'm going to introduce a new tool. B for brush, S for select. Now usually we use the select rectangle. I'll use the select lasso. Select lasso allows me to use Control, Shift, click, and drag so I can show and hide parts of the mesh using this lasso. You've seen me use it before. It has another effect which is really nice. If I Control, Shift, click on a face, I can hide a whole polygroup. If I Control, Shift, click on an edge like this, it will hide a poly loop. Okay, so now I can Control, click on the background to mask everything. And this is going to give me a cleaner effect. I go to my transpose gizmo. Make sure that X symmetry is off. I just want to make sure it's still snapped to the center, and it is, and I will just scale this up using the scale. Now look how much cleaner that is. So it gives us this nice kind of offset. I'm going to turn frame mode off. I don't want it to be quite that thick. Now I could move this in the Z axis. I could even scale it along one axis if I wanted to. So we could do something like that. So that gives us this nice little bit of detailing there. Control, click, drag on the background to clear the mask. And there we go. So while we're here, I'm actually just going to make a little change to this. I don't want to do such a broad sort of change. I just want to scale it like this, and I want to bring it down just slightly. There we go. So that gives us this really cool kind of almost spoiler effect in the back there. I quite like that. So let's go ahead and clear our mask, and I'm going to save my work. Now this piece I am going to save for you so you can download it when it's complete. So you can have this to look at if you want to kind of see firsthand some of the things that we did. So I'm just going to save this. My save dialog is off screen. It's just the regular save dialog. That's all. So there we go. So let's take a look at some other things that we can do. I'm just going to clean up my interface here a little bit and close out the left-hand dock, and I'm going to close my subtools and collapse some of these menus just to clean everything up just a little bit, give myself some more real estate. So let's change this section here, the sort of metal housing of the helmet itself that occurs in between these individual panels. So I will Control, Shift, click, and I'm still on my selection lasso So sometimes you might find it a little bit tricky to select just polygroups when you have a lot of subdivision levels. So in that case, you can just go to B for brush, S for select, and R for rectangle. We'll select the selection rectangle again. So we can hide this polygroup. Go into frame mode or isolate this polygroup. If I go into frame mode, I can go to visibility, grow, and that will naturally grow it around the next row of edge loops. So let's go ahead and mask this. Control-Shift-Click to reveal all, and then Control-Click. So we've got an unmasked area. I'll take the clay tubes brush, and I'm just going to build up some of these sections here, like this, for example. Let's build this up. And let's do a little bit of a build up through here. I'm just going to run my clay tubes brush along this area here. Let's build these up. And let's let this section kind of feed into this section here. And again, I'm treating this very organically. This is just organic sculpting, really. But we will then plane it back down into something hard surface. So we'll build that up. And let's transition this down into this surface here. Now I'll go to B for brush, T for trim, D for dynamic, and I can dynamically trim these areas. Like we saw before, we can start to create sort of sketched planes on here. So maybe I want to trim this down. Maybe I'll do a little bit of trim dynamic here, through here. Now we only have 224,000 faces right now, so we are going to be able to add a subdivision level to sharpen up areas as required. So I just want to get a little bit of a plane here and here, and through here, maybe down through here. And I'll do B for brush, P for polish. Now we have the polish brush. There is the soft polish, the regular polish. There's also B for brush, H for hard. We have a hard polish. So we use hard polish here. You see that's probably the most aggressive of the polish brushes. So here I can use this to sort of clean these compound curves here. This sort of area that's gone what I call wiggly, when it doesn't really have the type of machined surface that I'm looking for. Now I'm not adding a subdivision level yet. I'm happy to go ahead and do this on a lower subdivision level. Right here, just do a hard polish right along that transition on both sides, like this. There we go. And I'll zoom in here, do a little bit of polish there, and a little bit of polish here. I'm going to clear my mask and then Control D to add a subdivision level. And that's going to give me more geometry to work with. So if I zoom back in here and I start to hard polish this area, you see the difference in the effect of the brush. Be careful though, because I need to select this, go to visibility, grow, so I make sure that I get that extra edge loop there. And then it's going to keep that, it's going to protect that thickness there. So let's go ahead and polish this down to here. Now I always tell people in my ZBrush classes, the best way always to learn any ZBrush brush is to just open a sphere and experiment with it. Get a feel for it, because I can tell you what the brushes do, and I can show you what the brushes do. But there's a certain amount of learning that occurs with experiencing what the brush does compared to how hard you know you're pressing down with your hand, what you're, the types of brush strokes that you're accustomed to making, and what the brush does when you make those strokes. A lot of it's very personalized. So be sure to experiment with all these brushes. Don't feel like you have to use all of them. That's a big stumbling block for a lot of people at the beginning, because there's so many brushes. You don't have to use every one of them. It's not necessary. You just use the ones that you find work for you. It's similar to Maya. A lot of people open up Maya and they're really overwhelmed because Maya is a gigantic program. But a lot of people don't know everything in Maya. That's a specific type of generalist user, sort of a power user. A lot of us know our particular disciplines in Maya, like modeling with a little bit of dynamics, a little bit of rigging, but mainly modeling and texture. So, You don't have to learn every single piece of it, but I'm demonstrating all of it so you have it if you want to learn it. So here I'm going to use this hard polish just to get a nice little scallop right there. I like that. I like that bit there. So I'm going to go ahead now with my pinch brush, and I'm going to go to the stroke menu again. Go to stroke and tear this off. I just want to make sure that my lazy mouse is turned on. And if I turn on backtrack, instead of using line, you could use spline or path. If I use path, what that allows me to do is it allows me to trace a line like this, and then I can backtrack it like that. So that's pretty handy. And then I'll just run smooth along it to clean it up. Let's turn our draw size down, and we'll do that again. I'll start my curve here. I'll draw that path all the way up here, and then backtrack it. Now, because I'm not holding down the Alt key, it's pinching up. And that really makes a difference, I find, in areas like this. So I want to pinch this down. So I'll hold down the Alt key, draw this curve again, and then pinch it. And you see that's pinching in. And I'll repeat that a few times. Don't worry about it stretching because you hit it with a smooth brush. And the stretched faces are weaker, so to speak, than the pinched edges. So the pinched edge won't go away. It'll just get cleaned up a little bit. So I can do this. I can run my stroke along there. I'm just running my stroke back and forth by hand, turn up my brush size, and just hit it with a little bit of smooth. Same in here. Do a little bit of smoothing here. Now, I know a lot of people who do hard surface sculpting in ZBrush, and they actually like to change to a matte cap material while they're working, something that's metallic. And it is kind of cool. It's pretty exciting when you're using a metallic material like this because it actually does show off the surface quite nicely, and it's most likely the type of surface it's going to be seen as in the first place. So here you see right here, I'm grabbing that edge. That's something that can be real frustrating with the pinch brushes here. I'm distorting this area here. So what I will do is I will Control-Shift-Click on these, clear the mask, Control-Click to mask them all. So basically I've just masked right up to that edge. All right. So then I'm going to take my brush and I'm just going to hold down the Alt key and just do a little pinch right there. And I don't want that to be too intense. I just want a little bit of a sort of nuanced plane change. So there you go. You see what we get there. Turn my draw size down, and then I'll draw another path like this. I'll just sharpen that up. So let's do something else. Let's go ahead and Control-Shift-Click on this polygroup here, invert visibility, and do this one here as well. I'm going to mask everybody else, and I'm going to Control-Shift-Click to reveal all. And let's switch back to a basic material too. I'm going to go to my transpose gizmo, hold down the Alt key, and I'm going to move the pivot so it's sitting right here. And I might even, while I'm holding down Alt, change the angle a little bit. I'm going to rotate these like this. And you see, because we've got edge looping there, we're able to actually get a nicer edge to it. But once again, let's clear the masking. Go into frame mode. You see, we've got to capture one more edge along there. So I'm going to Control-Shift-Click again. Control-Shift-Click. Control-Shift-Click drag to invert. Control-Shift-Click to isolate that one. Control-Shift-Click drag to invert. Now, remember, I want to capture another couple edge loops, so I'm going to go to Tool, Visibility, Grow. And that's going to naturally grab the next row of edges because we used the group loop or panel loop to make these panel loops. They are encapsulated by panel loops. So I'm going to invert visibility. I'm going to frame mode. Control-Click on the, Control-Click on the background to mask everything else. Control-Shift-Click to reveal all. Now I'll go back to my transpose gizmo. Let's turn off frame mode. And then if we rotate this out, we get a nice sharper edge on that. Look at that. We could really bring that out a bit. So, although that's starting to look kind of like ears, so I don't really like that. We'll bring this back a little bit more just so we're getting this sort of shape where it's kind of sitting nicely and extruded out. So that's pretty cool. Control-Click and drag on the background to clear our masking. And let's do a little bit of modifications on this piece here. I'm going to isolate it and I'm going to grow. Go into frame mode and let's just see. Maybe we'll grow it one more time, get an extra poly loop there. Mask that, invert our masking, and maybe we'll take our transpose gizmo, turn off X symmetry, go to the unmasked mesh center, unlock the gizmo and then reset it, then lock it again. And now what I can do is I can bring this up, and then if I hold down the control key and click the outer shell there, or click the inner dot, it'll sort of expand out that shell. So that can be pretty cool. Let's look at it out of frame mode and see how that one reads to us. I like how that carries on that shape. If I undo that, you see this is a step down. If I redo it, I get this nice continuation of this curve here. So that's actually kind of cool. I think I'm going to go ahead and keep that. So I'm going to go to deformation, polish by features, and I'm just going to click polish by features. And look what that does. That just cleans up those sharp edges perfectly. So that's quite nice. I am going to isolate this area here, mask it, invert my mask, and I'm going to see what happens if I polish by features on this. Sometimes it's worth experimenting. Ooh, that one wasn't very good because it cleaned up all of my internal shapes. If I turn this button off and then polish by features, that can help. That helps get the little kind of wiggly bits that I talked about. That appears to be weaker, but what it's doing is it's respecting the hard edge plane changes more than if you turn this on and then polish. So let's invert this. Let's get just these bits here. Let's mask these. Control, click on the background, and let's see what happens if we polish these by features. There you go. That's actually kind of a nice effect there. It's just cleaning up some of our problem bits. There's a little wiggly bit right there. If I control click to feather my mask and then polish by features, you see what that does. It starts to give me this nice little lip there. See that? Let's do that again. Polish by features. See what's happening. There we go. So I've got a little bit of an issue in this area here that I want to resolve. So I'm going to control shift click on that. I'm going to go to visibility, grow a couple times there. And I'm going to go to my beaver brush, H for H polish. Grab my H polish brush and let's just do a little bit of hard polishing right here. And that's going in too much. I don't want that. I'm going to do soft polish, B for brush, S for soft, and grab my soft polish, S polish. Remember, it is labeled as S polish, and that's better. There we go. Do a little bit of polishing. Maybe we'll just soften that transition entirely so it's more of a smooth transition from the bottom up. Now, I can take my move brush, hold down the Alt key, and I can pull this whole area out like this. Let's mask that and reveal all, and then invert our mask, and then go back to our soft polish brush, and just do a little bit of polishing on that to fix that transition. And there we go. So let's isolate the visor. So there's a few things that we can do with the visor, and before we move on, I'm going to save my work again just by pressing Control S. Always save as you go. And I am also using the quick save, which is the number 9 hotkey. I'll press that as I'm talking, and it just saves a quick save. If we go to the Lightbox quick save folder here, it'll save it there, but don't rely on that for all of your saving. Definitely manually save as well.